we're about to spend the next hour talking about bad air. Before we get started, just by way of introduction, my name is Sarah. I'm a caver from Tucson, Arizona. I'm currently the Southwestern Regional Coordinator for the National Cave Rescue Commission, and I'm on a wilderness search and rescue team as well. I got really interested in bad air situations because of some experience that I had and some research that I've done in the past. And I was so excited to find colleagues who I'm going to let introduce themselves in a moment, who are also interested in bad air. So Will and Zenah, please feel free to introduce yourselves.
I'm Zenah Orndorff. I'm a soil scientist and also a caver, and also a member of our local rescue squad. And we have a cave rescue team with the Blacksburg Rescue.
And I'm Will Orndorff, and I'm a NCRC national instructor. And for my day job, I work with Department of Conservation in Virginia as a state cave specialist. And through the Blacksburg Rescue Squad and through NCRC and my work, we became real interested in this issue of bad air in caves.
So to get us started, I'm going to actually share a poll. I want to know more about whether or not you have experienced bad air. So feel free to take a couple seconds to answer that as we're getting the slides and everything up ready to go. All right, so it looks like about 2/3 of the folks out there have definitely experienced bad air, and then about 11% don't know. That's pretty much in line, I think, with kind of what we've heard about and the various stories that we've heard. But let's talk a little bit more about this as we go forward. So I started looking through the American caving accidents for some examples of some bad air experiences. So go ahead and get us to the next slide. And this is just one example. You can look it up yourself. It happened in September of 1990 in American caving accidents, where 3 cavers went to explore a virgin pit or a virgin cave, and they started to feel a little bit off. They suspected bad air. Then go ahead and hit the next slide. They pulled out the classic big lighter to try and test the air. It did not light. This is a very, very typical response to when you start to think bad air issues, and we're going to delve into what the lighter actually means and maybe some other ways that we can really start to tackle these issues of understanding bad air. So to provide a more recent cave exploration example, we have a video coming up where we have 3 experienced vertical cavers. It was the first time they had tried to descend this pit because it usually has bad air. However, the weather had recently changed, so they were hoping that maybe the air would be better in the cave. So we're going to transition over to that video now, but as you watch it, comment in the chat if you see any out of the ordinary behavior.
All right, Kelby, where are we at?
We're at the back at Mormon Creek Crevice. As far as I know, no one's ever been to the bottom of this pit. There's a trail description that was, or cave trip description that was written that
So that's normal behavior at the beginning as a baseline.
Stop here. Really pretty. No.
Is it the lighter or is it the air? We've done that game before, huh? Let me check it here. Good here. There's no way we can hand this lighter down, is there?
I think it might be the air.
Yeah. Is there any way you can catch this or lower it down to him, Jake?
Here, I'll blow a couple of them.
We're real good here.
I know. I didn't think it would be itchy, but I can already feel me breathing.
Yeah, I can already hear you breathing pretty hard.
Fuck.
Does anybody have a rubber band or tape?
Okay, let me just make an assessment real quick. Definitely a hole in the bottom. Definitely about 50-something feet. And I can definitely tell you, man. I should have my foot leg rigged.
Just slow down.
Man, that's depressing. You hear me breathing like a motherfucker?
Yeah. Slow down and think. You want us to haul you out?
Not yet. Not yet.
So in my experience, it's 17.5% O2 in the atmosphere. That's the last place the lighter will work. So below that, and here it is typically CO2 that displaces the oxygen. Oh, you got a longer step because of that carabiner. Are you gonna be able to make it? Give him one more step.
I got it.
All right, just climb, leave the rack and bring it with you.
Just check the air right here. You'll check it.
Come on up, Cody.
Come on up to good air and then we'll mess with that.
Okay. I'll push into the anchor.
Yeah, we're good. We're good right here at the top of the drop.
Damn.
Push out a little bit.
All right, so we saw quite a few folks commenting in the chat some of the things that were noticed, including work of breathing increased, moving the rope from side to side, trying to remember how to change over. And that's still on presenter view for some reason, Will, just so you know. So some folks mentioned some umbles, some confusion. A lot of folks had some suggestions about how to actually get him out. So haul him out would be something to do, or climbing without the rack, or sorry, with the rack still attached. I think I saw that as well. Trouble with simple tasks and basic mental logic suggests they should exit. So that's a very good point. Something is off, and honestly, it's not just the person down the pit, right? The person down the pit is clearly not thinking properly, but the other folks at the top with slightly better air were also not really thinking super properly. So yeah, Will, sorry, that's still on presenter view. Can you put it back to just the full screen view? And yeah, so I'm pretty sure that I think everybody got all of the things that that we had noticed. It was a little hard with the video there, but the climbers' hands were also trembling. And one of the things that happened in the middle of the video is they started talking about the understanding of oxygen percentages and the lighter behavior, and we're going to dig into that because there was definitely some other stuff going on there. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about what is bad air. Obviously, the easy answer is air that's not good air. There's a lot of other gases that could be the problem here. Like we heard a great story earlier today about propane and that being an issue in a cave setting. But our focus here is on oxygen, or O2, and carbon dioxide, or CO2. In normal atmospheric air, we have 78% nitrogen and 21% oxygen. And then carbon dioxide takes up a little tiny percentage, which is 0.04%. In caves, however, the level of carbon dioxide can be substantially higher. And this varies for a number of different reasons. Next slide, please. So when we think about cave environments, caves are open to the influence of atmospheric air outside. They have entrances, they have different ways that air can get into the cave. And lots of factors can affect how much that air flows, either from season to season, from year to year. It could be the size of the entrance, the morphology of the cave. It can be whether or not there's water in the cave, whether there's weather events going on that are causing turnover, the surrounding soil and geology. All of these things can affect the carbon dioxide levels inside caves. Now, places that we know about with limestone caves that have naturally occurring bad air include Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, the Great Valley area back east, southern Indiana, Missouri, Nevada, various locations in Mexico and Central America. But quite frankly, this is just a list that we started when we started this project. So we know there are many other places. Please report all of your bad air caves to the NCRC Bad Air Force, which is completely ad hoc, self-designated group with no official standing. But we want to know about what's going on in your caves and what your bad air experiences are. So now I'd like to pass it over to Zenah, who's going to talk a little bit more about how these types of bad air environments form.
Okay, so if we're concerned about bad air being increased carbon dioxide, the next question would be, where's that carbon dioxide coming from? The main answer to this is that it's respiration that's occurring in the soil and the epikarst. So organisms, this could be plant roots, soil fauna, soil microbes, all those organisms are going to be consuming oxygen and consuming organic matter and converting it over to carbon dioxide and water. So that's just a simple formula representing that oxygen and organic matter get consumed, carbon dioxide and water get produced. One of the main things we want to point out with the respiration reaction is that for every one oxygen molecule consumed, one carbon dioxide molecule is getting produced. So in terms of our air composition, for every decrease of 1% of the oxygen, that's a 1% carbon dioxide increase. Another way to look at it is because we're only changing up oxygen and carbon dioxide, respiration is not affecting the nitrogen levels or other gases in the air, that the oxygen and carbon dioxide are going to maintain a total volume of 21%. So we borrowed this figure from this article that it pretty nicely represents some of the things that we want to talk about. The main things being that, again, we said the air that's surrounding the cave, so the air filling in the epikarst, is going to be enriched in carbon dioxide. That enriched carbon dioxide can move into the cave through a couple mechanisms, one simply being just the air moving into the cave and it has more carbon dioxide in it. Another mechanism is that water that's flowing through the epikarst is going to dissolve carbon dioxide. And then as that water flows into the cave, that carbon dioxide can degas into the cave. And then both of these are going to be affected by air movement in and out of the cave with the atmosphere. So we're going to talk about all of that a little bit more. And if you look through the literature, you may find references to replacement or type 2 environments and displacement or type 1 environments. We're going to talk about both of those. So I'm starting with type 2 because it just kind of makes sense to us to start with type 2 and then talk about type 1. So with the replacement environment, we're starting off looking at we have the atmosphere, so our 78% nitrogen, got it represented here, 21% oxygen, and just a little bit of carbon dioxide. And then as we move into the soil and the epikarst, we're going to have that enrichment of carbon dioxide, so increasing carbon dioxide levels. And then, like we said, the air mass from the epikarst can move into the cave through fissures. So we're just pushing this air into the cave. And just as an example, as we said, nitrogen's not going to change, so it's maintaining the 78%. Oxygen and carbon dioxide are going to maintain that 21%. So every one decrease in oxygen and one increase in carbon dioxide. So if we have 3% carbon dioxide, we're looking at 18% oxygen. All right, so another mechanism that's going on, like we said, we have water that's flowing through the epikarst. Because the soil and epikarst air is enriched with carbon dioxide, that's going to promote this reaction moving to the right, or dissolution of carbon dioxide into water. So carbon dioxide is being carried along in the water, flowing to the cave. When that enriched water flows out into the cave, the carbon dioxide can degas into the cave. And we'll take a look again, looking at an example, because the numbers are going to work a little bit different now than when we are talking about the replacement reaction. So let's just start off again with a volume of air. We've got 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, a little bit of carbon dioxide. We're going to pretend that this is a volume of air in a cave at atmospheric composition. And now we're going to have our stream flowing into the cave, and this stream is saturated with carbon dioxide. So as it enters into the cave from the epikarst, the carbon dioxide is going to start degassing into the cave air. So at the bottom of our volume, we see this incoming mass of carbon dioxide heading to our sample area. And as that carbon dioxide moves into our sample area, for every percent that it moves in, it's going to displace an equal amount. So if 5% of the volume is now being taken up by carbon dioxide that's degassed into there, then we're going to lose 5% or displace 5% out of that volume. But it's going to equally displace all the gases. So that 5% is going to be proportionally, 4% of that, or 80% of it, or 4% of nitrogen is going to be displaced. And then we're going to lose 1% of our oxygen from our initial volume. So now what we end up with in our sample area is 74% nitrogen, because 4% of it got displaced, 20% oxygen, because 1% got displaced, but now 5% carbon dioxide. So the main difference to note here is that we decreased 1% oxygen, but we increased 5% carbon dioxide. And now our carbon dioxide and oxygen are going to end up being greater than 21%. So then other factors that are going to affect the amount of carbon dioxide, the replacement and the displacement is talking about how carbon dioxide gets into the cave. Well, what else is affecting how air is moving around in and out of the cave? And carbon dioxide moving in. Well, in the summer, we're going to have more active respiration because it's warmer. This means more carbon dioxide in the epikarst, which means more carbon dioxide to be pushed into the cave. In the winter, we have less active respiration, and also because of thermal turnover, that's going to promote atmospheric air sinking into the cave, which is going to help lower the carbon dioxide closer to atmospheric conditions, which is what we like to see. If a high pressure front moves through, it can do the same thing in terms of pushing air into the cave, which is good for maintaining lower carbon dioxide levels. And then with a low pressure front, it can do the opposite, suck air out and increase degassing into the cave. So again, just to summarize, having talked about all those mechanisms, we have our cave, we have the epikarst surrounding the cave. The air in that epikarst is going to tend to be carbon dioxide enriched because of organisms. The respiration is using up oxygen and producing carbon dioxide. That enriched carbon dioxide air can, just as an air mass, move into the cave through fissures. The carbon dioxide can get dissolved into water, flow into the cave, and then degas. The amount to which, like either of those reactions, is going to be kind of site specific, how much each of those reactions or mechanisms are contributing to the carbon dioxide in the cave. And then that's further going to be affected by how air is moving in and out and exchanging with the atmosphere, which again, as we discussed, is being affected by a lot of things, seasons and climate and just the nature of the cave passage. So a lot of interactions going on. And this is just kind of a simplified version of it to explain the basics of how carbon dioxide is getting in the cave.
Okay, thanks, Zenah. So there's some other high carbon dioxide environments you may encounter in caves. One of the first talks in the series we heard earlier this spring was from Eddie Cartaya talking about fumarole caves developed in glaciers. on tops of volcanoes, really extreme environment. And I'm not going to repeat everything Eddie said, but I encourage you to look at Eddie's talk that's off of the YouTube channel and see just what an extreme CO2 environment in one of those fumarole caves looks like, and some of the measures that those folks go to mitigate in that environment. There are also some anthropogenic sources you're going to run into in a variety of more traditional cave settings. Exhaust fumes might be coming into the cave from something you're doing, like cave gate construction or passage modification, etc. Wildfire smoke can come into the caves, and both of those are going to bring other contaminants in with them, not just CO2. Another thing that we have to be particularly attentive to in cave rescue is the accumulation of human respiration product or exhalations in a poorly ventilated environment. So before we go on, there's a second poll Sarah's going to put up now.
So yeah, this poll asks, what percentage of carbon dioxide is immediately dangerous to life and health? So we'll leave it up for a half a minute or so. All right, anyone else want to vote? We got a couple more votes coming in. All right, I'm going to share the results of that. So it looks like about half folks selected 4% as the IDLH, or immediately dangerous to life and health level, but there was some spread there. So I'll hand it back to Will now.
Okay, yeah, so that was, whoops, go back. That was really interesting because if half of you got it right, I'm going to be the glass half full kind of guy here. So from the Keyhole Cave incident in New York in 1997, this is again the write-up from American Caving Accidents, but there was somebody stuck in a cave with very poor airflow, and a lot of rescuers were needed to bring that person out. And people were complaining of problems breathing, so they brought an oxygen meter down, and they discovered that the oxygen levels were only 16.9%, which probably means that the CO2 levels were around 4%, which is right at that IDLH number that the National Institute for Occupation Safety and Health has designated. So let's talk a little bit more about these numbers from a variety of perspectives. As Zenah pointed out earlier, atmospheric air is about 21% oxygen, 400 ppm CO2 and rising, unfortunately. In the soil air, you're going to have decreased oxygen and increased CO2 because of respiration. Really don't have a good idea in the soil epicars just how high it gets. We assume it probably gets 5 to 10% because we see those values sometimes in some of the more extreme cave environments. If we get down to the last 4 rows on the diagram, we see we're talking about sort of some standards from occupational health and safety. So there's 2 different entities here that make these recommendations. The National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health comes up with some CO2 recommendations. The recommended exposure level for an 8-hour work day or work shift is 0.5% or 5,000 ppm CO2. The short-term exposure limit, which you're supposed to be able to tolerate for 15 minutes, is 3% CO2. And then the immediate danger to life and health is anything over 4% CO2 or over 40,000 ppm. NIOSH doesn't have a whole lot to say about oxygen. OSHA, however, does, and they consider an oxygen deficient atmosphere anything less than 19.5%. So if we look now at the health effects, let's kind of look down not at the standards, but at the documented health effects. For oxygen, at 19.5 again is the OSHA standard, but from 15 to 19, people seem decreased ability to work strenuously, impaired coordination, early symptoms of other problems with oxygen. You can see at lower percentages, 12 to 14, your judgment decreases, respiration rate increases. Get below 14% down in the 10-12 range, things start going south pretty quickly. And then by the time you're down below 8%, you're definitely in the death zone. But really below 10% is somewhere you don't obviously want to be at all. Now, a lot of people will say, well, this is just analogous to being at altitude because the partial pressure of O2 goes down, so it acts like a lower percentage at altitude, and that's fine for altitude, but that really doesn't apply when we get to a CO2 elevated cave environment, because we have this other thing to consider, and that's the physiological effects of carbon dioxide elevation. So again, the NIOSH 8-hour permissible exposure level is 0.5%. As we go down and look at the actual symptoms, about 1.5%, you're going to start seeing for many people some effects on their respiration, a little bit faster respirations. At 3%, you're going to see most people are going to show some signs of respiratory stimulation, higher heart rate, increased blood pressure. By 4%, you're at that IDLH number, and that's a number kind of interesting because it gets to where the partial pressure is approaching that of the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in a healthy person's blood at atmospheric pressure. What that means is it becomes increasingly difficult to exchange oxygen with the atmosphere in your lungs, no matter how fast you breathe. By that 5%, you start to see strong respiratory stimulation, dizziness, confusion, headache, shortness of breath. By the time you're up to 8%, you're really getting into the death zone. One thing to point out, and we'll repeat this over and over again during the talk, is that these symptoms seem to vary from individual to individual, and also that sometimes these effects are delayed. We'll have people report the effects of a high CO2 environment after leaving the cave because your blood chemistry doesn't immediately return to zero or return to baseline. The other thing that's interesting, and I welcome any information that anybody in the audience may share on this, is the combination of high carbon dioxide and low oxygen. You know, both of those charts were kind of developed at looking at those contaminants in isolation, or those gases in isolation. I could find those studies, or we could find those studies of a combination. High CO2 produces, the important thing here is high carbon dioxide produces severe effects quicker than lowering oxygen levels do. And we can't help but suspect the effects are likely compounded when you have both going on. Again, high carbon dioxide caves are really not like being at altitude. Even though the partial pressure of oxygen is similar, it's decreasing. The partial pressure of CO2 is increasing. And this causes it to be dramatically different physiologically when you're in a high CO2 environment. Last point, I talked to Dr. Iki about this, the current NCRC medical director. He said, unless you have COPD, human breathing is being driven by the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in your bloodstream. And in high CO2 environments, that level increases to whatever level it needs to be to drive gas exchange in your lungs. And with higher CO2 in the bloodstream, you get decreasing blood pH. And to paraphrase Dr. Iki, makes lots of bad stuff happen. Now I'm going to pass on to Sarah for some more subtle effects we might encounter.
So yeah, thanks, Will. What's interesting out in the literature, if you start to look at some of the effects of carbon dioxide on human cognition, is it's not firmly settled. There are some studies that go one way or the other. There are no studies that we could find that look at anything higher than about 1.5% at CO2. And so there are some most of the studies look at much lower levels, kind of like what you would see in an indoor air environment. So this is an example of a study that was actually done quite a while ago now in 2012. And this is shows the impact of carbon dioxide levels on human decision-making performance. And so on the left side is kind of a measure from green is good to red is bad or dysfunctional, as you can see there. And along the bottom, it shows a variety of different tests and activities that they put the various study participants through. So a key thing to note is that the dark black dots there, the highest CO2 level that they studied in this study was 0.25%. So that is not very high at all compared to some of the environments that we're seeing in caves. However, if you look at the performance of the study subjects when the CO2 levels were only 2,500 ppm or 0.25%, you can see that they were pretty severely lacking in initiative, information utilization, breadth of approach, and basic strategy. So now let's think about putting a whole bunch of people underground in high carbon dioxide environments where they're making critical rescue decisions and dealing with a whole bunch of technical equipment. And you might start to wonder, are we doing the right thing here? Are we protecting our rescuers well enough to be able to make the types of decisions that they're going to need to make underground to be able to rescue somebody who's in a bad way. And so some of these effects are pretty subtle, like Will said. We actually kept track of some of them at the most recent South Central Regional National Cave Rescue Commission week-long training, where we asked people to write down some of their experiences. And so, for instance, some of the sentences and some of the comments that we got from folks were things like, can you pass me some of that flat stuff that we use to tie things? So someone literally could not remember the word webbing. Someone was trying to answer a question, felt like they were thinking clearly, but they couldn't get the words to go from the brain to their mouth, and it sounded like they were drunk. A student was asked about her involvement with rescue, and she said that I do that thing where you walk around outside and look for people. We think she means search and rescue, but once again, those words were not present. The next one was actually mine. I had an incident where it felt like I was breathing through a straw and there was just no air suddenly. And I was like, well, that was weird, but I didn't think it was a big enough deal to warrant getting out immediately. So my brain was not really working properly there. And then in another case, some folks were using this lighter test and the lighter wouldn't work at the bottom of the drop, but we felt okay. So we stayed down there anyway. I felt sick all the next day and stayed at the lodge. So a lot of these are examples of something called enomic aphasia, where the words aren't quite coming properly. And it was one of the first things that we started to notice among a lot of the students and instructors that were exposed to these higher environments. However, we are all individuals, and so our responses to high carbon dioxide environments vary pretty dramatically. Some people might get really sick at 1 or 2%. Some people might be able to tolerate much higher percentages. Not recommending that. I'm just saying that people can definitely do that. So based on all of this, we actually are undertaking a current carbon dioxide study. The goals of this include to evaluate the occurrence of bad air at caves around the United States and to better understand some of the processes involved in why we get bad air. We are analyzing gas samples from a variety of different caves with Dan Breeker at UT Austin. We are interested in determining why some locations are more prone to higher levels of carbon dioxide. We'd like to evaluate both the cognitive and physiological signs and symptoms for cavers exposed to high carbon dioxide environments. And we would like to try and determine how the cave atmosphere can be monitored in an affordable and efficient manner. Of course, thinking about routine cave exploration, but also rescue operations, because that's what brought us all to this particular work. So that gets us to start talking about how do we measure carbon dioxide and oxygen. So these are some examples of some handheld field meters that we've kind of begun to rely on to do this. So on the left side there is actually a carbon dioxide meter. It's a standalone carbon dioxide meter. That's all it does. It goes up to about 5%. And in this particular case, you can see it says 4%. You can also use a 4-gas meter for oxygen. It measures some other gases as well, depending on the type of model. But a typical 4-gas meter does not measure carbon dioxide. On the right-hand side of this picture is actually a standalone oxygen meter that you can get. These are the CO2 meter. It can be hundreds of dollars depending on the type of model. Oxygen you can get for a little bit cheaper, but it's still not cheap because fundamentally you're trying to measure the air and keep safe with that. So because these aren't cheap, we want some cheap solutions, right? And so one of the cheapest solutions that we always seem to talk about is this lighter test. So I'm going to throw up another poll right now, and I'm going to ask what all y'all's understanding is about the lighter, both in terms of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So there's 2 questions for this poll. The first is when the lighter doesn't light, what approximate % of oxygen is present? And then when the lighter doesn't light, what % of carbon dioxide is present? So go ahead and take a stab at that right now.
And remember to scroll down to see all the answers in your poll.
Right. Yeah, there's 4 or 5 answers for each one, so make sure to scroll down so you see all of those. All right, let's leave it up for another couple of seconds. Still have a handful of folks making up their minds, reading the questions. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and share the results. So overarchingly, people thought that the lighter test tells you if the lighter doesn't light, it suggests that there's 17% oxygen, or of course less than that. When the lighter doesn't light, oh, that looks like a typo, sorry about that. What percentage of carbon dioxide is present? Looks like the most popular answer was 3%, but also some folks thought maybe 4% or unknown. So let's go ahead and talk about this lighter test right now. Okay. So Gary Smith, who actually was on the call earlier, may still be here, did some studies in Australia in the mid-90s that indicated that a butane lighter will extinguish at oxygen concentrations of 14.5%. An older study in a cave in Colorado Bend State Park suggested that the lighter extinguished at oxygen concentrations of 17%. More recently, we tried to replicate a lot of this, and it seems as if lighters were extinguishing in caves, once again in Colorado Bend State Park, at 17.5%. The reason we know this is because we were also carrying an oxygen meter, but that's something that it seems to be, there's a range there, but the lighter seems to start not working very well at levels of 17% or less. So we have a couple of videos that we're going to share next. This is one that I took that focused, I was measuring oxygen on the left. You'll see the levels around 17.9, CO2 in the middle, it's around 3.3%, and then the lighter behaving almost normally. And so, yeah, they're both going now. So I spent about 15 minutes at this location in various places down this alley, and then I had to spend a few hours outside the cave just trying to get myself to feel back to normal. However, we had another caver who was willing to go a little bit further, so this is what the lighter does at around 4%.
I'm right here. Give me 1 second. Yeah.
And what's important here is that the lighter isn't responding to the CO2 levels, it's responding to the oxygen levels. But in general, the lighter's behaving weirdly. So that's a good thing to notice and keep in mind. Like we mentioned before, CO2 meters are very expensive, but Zenah is going to tell us right now about a much cheaper option that might be an alternative for us to be measuring these environments when we're heading out and caving or rescue.
Okay, so Sarah pointed out the lighter is not necessarily going to be effective for letting us know if we have elevated CO2. CO2 meters are great, but they're expensive, and it's just extra weight in your pack too. They're not tiny. So a few years ago, when we were at South Central NCRC, we were kind of having this CO2 brain dump, trying to come up with ideas, and it came up with the idea of, well, what about those little CO2 detectors we use when you're doing CPR? So if you're not familiar with this, the basic idea, you can see it set up there on the mannequin on the left. Simulating that this patient is CPR is being performed, they're being ventilated. So you can see there's an airway, the airway's in, there's the bag to push air, and then the CO2 detector is being mounted in between so that it can indicate if CO2 is being exhaled. At low carbon dioxide or normal atmospheric air, it's going to be a purplish color. As CO2 increases, this kind of purplish color. As CO2 increases, it's going to move along this gradient going from purple through the grays and then to yellow. Since we exhale at about 4%, if we blow into one of these, it's going to turn yellow. The other option is that it's failed, because when they stop working, they fail to yellow. So as you can tell, because our mannequin is not actually blowing out CO2, but staged for the photo. But these are really great because they react pretty quickly. As soon as you blow into it, you open one up, it's purple. If you blow into it, it turns yellow within seconds. If you stop blowing into it and just let it sit out at room air, it turns back to purple within 10 seconds. Blow into it again, it turns yellow again. Let it sit out at atmospheric air, it turns purple again. So not only does it react quick, but it's going to keep changing back and forth with the air quality. So what we did last year when we were at the Texas NCRC, we got a bunch of these from our squad and just tried them out throughout the week. Every day we opened up a new one because we wanted to see how long they were going to last, because we really had no idea going into this. Was it going to last hours? Was it going to last days or weeks? So every day we opened a new one, numbered it. We also had ones that were pretty much like around their expiration date, and we had several that were past their expiration date, and some of them by several years. I mean, some of them were like 9 years past the expiration date on the package. So we also were trying to see how long do they keep working past that expiration date, like when you open a brand new package that's past its expiration date. So this is just part of our collection of these little easy caps that we use throughout the week. And on the left, you can see we've got them laid out there. They're also different sizes because there's the adult and the pediatric version. But on the left, you can see the carbon dioxide is at about 620 parts per million. So only, I mean, just very, very slightly elevated, because atmospheric air would be about 400 part per million. And seeing that our oxygen's at about 20.9. And you can see that they're all purple, different shades, because again, they were all, you know, some of them had been open longer, some of them had older expiration dates, but still all purple. And then the picture to the right are the same, it's the same setup, laid out more or less the same there. And you can see there with the carbon dioxide detector that it's at 1.25% carbon CO2. And now you can see that they've pretty much all, you know, they're starting to turn yellow, or at least they're moving in that direction. And when we used them all week, just in and out of caves, going in and out of bad air, and we had the monitors, the meters to confirm what we were looking at, they were pretty much just kind of spot on with what we were seeing with the meter. So, I mean, you're not going to have a super quantitative use with them, but just to get an idea, you know, you're in a cave and, you know, you're using your lighter and your lighter's still working, but you have reason to believe that there could be elevated carbon dioxide. This is just a quick and easy way to check that worked really great for us over the course of that week.
Okay, so if that's not nerdy enough for you, we went to the next level, and we decided we would actually not just measure these gases with field meters, but collect some. And Sarah knew about this guy, Dan Breeker at UT Austin. We contacted Dan. He has a lab, and he specializes in studying gases that are in the shallow subsurface and in epikarst. And we told him what we were up to. He said, yeah, I'd love to see your samples and play with you guys. So in addition to doing the meter measurements, we also went out and we collected in these, you can see this Mylar bag here behind those meters. We collected gas samples at different locations and at the South Central Seminar. We've also been doing it a few other places across the country, mainly in Virginia, in addition to Texas at this point. But what you see here are our samples from the February 2020 seminar at Colorado Bend. The y-axis is depletion in the change in O2 in percentage from atmosphere, and the x-axis is the increase in CO2. And if you remember earlier, Zenah talked about respiration. So in a theoretical world, in respiration, all the points should fall on this line. Unfortunately, respiration doesn't just occur by itself. There's always a little bit of diffusion. So respiration plus diffusion would fall on this line. The degassing that you talked about, the type 1 displacement, falls on this line. Now, what's really important about this graph and about our results is that as you get to high levels, you start getting into an area where the results are not just disturbing because they're high CO2, but they're paradoxically disturbing because they're relatively high oxygen. So you get out in this space, we have samples here that are over the IDLH, the immediate danger to life and health for carbon dioxide, but in a territory where the lighter test still works just fine. So you have plenty of oxygen, but you're in a CO2 enriched atmosphere that is starting to cause some pretty severe physiological effects. And you can know these symbols refer to specific caves at Colorado Bend. So we found these conditions at 3 different caves in Colorado Bend State Park. And these in particular from a cave called Gorman Falls Cave that's kind of famous and notorious for high carbon dioxide levels. And we'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide here. So this is Gorman Falls Cave entrance. It is such a wonderful cave structurally for cave rescue practice that NCRC South Central actually goes to the trouble to ventilate this thing down to where the air quality in the cave is acceptable for use. And we use it for training during the South Central seminar. It's a wonderful place for training, except for the horrible air. So the solution there has historically been to ventilate it. You can see this industrial ventilation unit with ventilation tube going down the cave entrance here. Okay. If you look at a map of the cave, what you can see here is cross section. Here's the entrance. It's got 3 drops. First drop's like 35 feet, second drop 20 feet or so, and the third drop 15 feet or so to a large stream in the bottom of the cave. You probably remember some of these pictures from earlier. This is the stream that we suspect is degassing CO2. So this cave is probably doing a combination of that type 1 and type 2 atmospheres, which kind of makes it a sort of nightmare scenario for CO2. So we were only able to sample this cave after ventilation. So the samples that you saw in the earlier graph were that bad after extensive ventilation. And we thought, wonder what it's like when we can't go in there. So we installed sample tubes to all 3 levels. So each of these stars represents a sampling location within the cave. Now on the bottom of the cave at Gorman Falls, the CO2-rich water is coming up from the spring, degassing, and it's adding that displacement component to the CO2 in the cave. All right, so this is in November of 2020. Last Thanksgiving, we braved the pandemic and drove down to Austin, and went out to Colorado Bend, and we accessed our tubing. So these tubes run from the entrance all the way down to the sampling locations. And what we find was interesting. We made this little flow-through chamber here with our meters in it. And we looked at the meters. We looked at the CO2 meter at first. We said, oh, that's not too bad. It's only 4.7%. But then we looked at the oxygen levels. Well, the oxygen level was only 12.5%. And we quickly realized that this is pretty much the scale limit on the CO2 meter. So our CO2 was off the scale, and our oxygen levels were down to 12.5% at the bottom of the cave, which means that the CO2 was probably at least 8.4%, and given the displacement component, probably over 10%. So this was a death zone environment under natural conditions, and it's just a couple of short drops into the cave, probably less than 200 linear feet from where I'm sitting there in that photo. We also did some of this sampling in other caves across the U.S., a couple in Virginia. This is an interesting one. This is a cave that Eastern cavers might well be familiar with. It's a very biologically important cave. It's now owned by the Cave Conservancy of the Virginias. But anyway, people would always complain about this hill. You see down where these cavers are is the bottom of the hill in Madison Saltpeter Cave. That's what's called the East Lake. So there's phreatic water table there. But everybody would always complain about how steep that hill was, or how out of shape they were coming up from there. Well, a couple of years ago, we actually took a lighter in there and realized that we've got high CO2 in this cave as you descend this slope. And when we measured it last fall, we found out that the levels were over 2.5 or about 2.5% of CO2 here. Another cave that I have to go into for work because I unfortunately found a rare species there. I have been in this particular cave. And this is a caver going into the monitoring area. They have to go through this little trap to get into the location where we monitor. We've had oxygen levels below 16%. We measured a CO2 level of 3% last year, but it likely gets to 5% or higher levels in this cave. So that's kind of a synopsis of what we've been doing on the science end to date.
Right. So that's where we are thus far on the science, but fundamentally we also are all cavers and rescuers, right? And so the bottom line for everything that we've said today is that if your lighter does not work, get out. It means there's not enough oxygen. But if your lighter does work, it could still be incredibly dangerous. CO2 could still be dangerously high. And so this is why we need some kind of solution that is a CO2 monitoring solution, whether that's a dedicated CO2 meter or some of the easy caps, which you can get on Amazon. But just really realizing that CO2 monitoring is something that you can't do with a lighter, and it's potentially dangerous to your health, to the efficacy of the rescue, to your mission, to whatever else, is something that we are definitely taking away from this work thus far. So what can you do about it? There's a couple different things. The first is, go ahead and hit the next slide real quick. The first is that if you know there are risk factors for your area, then definitely that's a big thing to think about for actually getting dedicated CO2 monitoring. Some example risk factors are other bad air caves, and a lot of cavers know about those. Or back to Will's mention of the keyhole cave rescue, tight passages with a lot of people, you could actually be producing a bad air condition in those cases. Paying close attention to symptoms, and when things don't feel quite right, paying attention to each other and starting to say like, oh, that guy said the wrong thing. Maybe something is going on here. Maybe the air is not as good as we think. It's also important to think about choosing a limit for both oxygen and carbon dioxide that is reasonable for caves, cavers, and rescuers. And what I mean by that is that if you choose the OSHA limit of 0.5%, there are some rescues that would actually be okay to do, and you have rescuers who would easily be able to operate in those conditions. Cavers regularly cave at 0.5% and have, you know, a great time and successful trips. But if you chose that limit, then that suggests that there might be some rescues that you would have to ventilate a cave, or you'd have to do something else to actually do that. So there are, of course, additional things you can do, which include you can actually measure or monitor the air. And that's the biggest thing that we're talking about. For oxygen, the lighter or a 4-gas meter or a standalone oxygen meter. For carbon dioxide, the easy caps we've been talking about, CO2meter.com. We're not actually endorsing any particular products, but that is where we got our standalone CO2 meters. Some 6-gas meters, you can optionally add a CO2 sensor. I know that John Lyles, who's also on the call right now, has looked a lot into a whole bunch of different types of meters for this. So he would be a good source if you are looking to get some of those meters moving forward. You can also mitigate for bad air. So what we mean by that is consider ventilation like we do for Gorman Falls in dangerously high CO2 environments, or consider self-contained breathing apparatuses, because that might be another solution for some of those places that you can't otherwise access. And then a general kind of risk management discussion question is, where are the important command decisions being made? Are the decision makers possibly under the influence of bad air? Think about enhanced safety check procedures, where you might do something as a real quick safety check at the surface, but maybe it's worth doing an enhanced procedure underground because of these strange environments. So based on all of that, where we're going next with this, we would like to expand the CO2 research regionally beyond Texas and Virginia, which are the two main areas right now that we've been taking air grab samples. We also know there's a bunch of actual bad air studies that are going on in the US as well as elsewhere in the world. And we'd like to coordinate a little bit more across those. So if you know about one of those, or if you want to participate, please let us know. And then very importantly, please report your bad air experiences to the American Caving Accidents or to whatever caving accident journal you subscribe to. Hopefully it's that one, because then we'll start to get a better handle on where these are. Even if nothing goes wrong, we'll get a better handle on where these types of things are happening. So with all of that, we're going to throw up our email addresses on the screen right there. However, we also have to acknowledge some folks. So let's go ahead and actually jump forward to that. And we are being greatly helped by Dan Breeker's lab at the University of Texas, Austin. The NCRC South Central region provided some funding for us to purchase supplies to be able to do some of those air grab samples. Colorado Bend State Park, of course, allows us to hold the week-long training there, but also allowed us to go into some caves to do some sampling. And then Blacksburg Volunteer Rescue Squad and Virginia DCR Natural Heritage Program also help provide funding and possibly some other stuff for us to be able to do this. So with that, there were some excellent questions in the chat. I did not stay on top of all of them. I'm sorry, but now is a great time for us to just open it up to questions for everybody. So thank you so much for hanging out with us, and we look forward to talking about carbon dioxide with you. Does anybody have any questions?
Terrific presentation. Yeah, if you had a question in the chat and you didn't get it answered, go ahead and unmute yourself. And if you can, show your video and then ask that question.
I noticed one question, I think Jenna answered it, about the Gorman Falls cave ventilation, whether we were pulling air out or putting air in. I didn't make the decision on how that ventilation is done, but traditionally that's been pushing air into the cave. And I think the idea is that, you know, we create a slightly positive pressure environment. It's going to increase stuff moving back into the, you know, into the apicarst, and we're introducing fresh air into the cave. I'd be interested to hear what the rationale for pulling the bad air out as opposed to pushing fresh air in was, because I don't really have a dog in that race as to which way it is better. I think Matt Bowers was the one who brought that up. Is Matt still on? No. Okay. Oh, there he is. I see him. The Sasquatch, at least.
He commented in the chat.
Oh, did he? Okay.
Does anyone else have any other question? Okay, anyone know how high CO2 affects bat populations? I'm gonna punt that over to Will. Maybe he knows.
Well, you would think it would have a significant effect, but one of the higher CO2 caves on the park is a Gorman, which we don't go into because of bats, but Bill Elliott did a bunch of work in Gorman Cave, which is right along the river in Colorado Bend, and it has extremely high CO2 levels, comparable to what we see, maybe not quite as high as what we see in Gorman Falls, but 5, 6, 7% CO2 levels. So it appears that the bat populations that use that cave either are staying out of that really bad zone, but are fairly tolerant of high CO2 levels. And that's just I think Midas velifers, and there may be some also some Mexican freetails that use it seasonally.
Thanks, Will.
I got a question. What about a cave that's known to be traveled a lot by people and no air problems? Could that eventually have an air problem because of the people?
I think you'd have to have a particularly poorly ventilated cave. I think it'd be really interesting actually to put some CO2 levels in some places like Luray Caverns in Virginia. And I know there's been CO2 meters in some commercial caves. I think they had one in Carlsbad. I know Sarah had some at Kartchner. And did you guys pick up a signal of CO2 from visitors?
So not in Kartchner, we didn't, but I did when I was looking into that study or designing that. We looked at some caves in China where they have a national recreation day, and I'm probably messing up the name for that. But in one case, they had a cave that I think had something like 30,000 extra people on a particular day. It was a fairly big cave, but you could still see the CO2 that changed on that particular day because it was just so many more folks in the cave at that time.
I'll tell you a story. One time, some of us from the East Region went to Ireland to give some presentations at a European Cave Rescue Conference. And the day after we got there, the two guys wimped out, but I went with some Irish cavers to Palney Gollum, which is where the name Gollum comes from in Lord of the Rings, which is a very wet sort of stream cave. And we just hopped in and then went through this very into the stream, and then went through this narrow crawlway, dusty crawlway over to another part, and then came back. And as we were going through the crawlway, I'm going, gee, I can't breathe in here. Maybe I have asthma, maybe it's acting up. I'm not wheezing. Maybe I'm just jet lagged from the flight. Maybe I'm just getting claustrophobic and I can't go caving anymore. And then we got out into the stream and I started breathing again and said, oh yeah, well, didn't we tell you there's no air movement in there? So everyone, it fills up with carbon dioxide, and the last person through doesn't have any oxygen, has too much carbon dioxide. So I said, thanks for telling me.
I have a question. There's a cave that some of us have been exploring in Belize that has bad air. And so there's some passages that we haven't actually been able to push because the air is always been bad in those passages. And we take in air meters, we have oxygen meters, and so that's how we know. And we can also feel some of the effects. But there's been this ongoing discussion about when is the best time to visit the cave and when would the air be most likely to be better. Now, it's never cold in Belize, so you don't really have winter, but you do have higher water levels in the earlier part of the season where we usually go, and they actually prevent the air from going through, like it just sumps the passage in certain places. So the air can't go through, so you don't get much of an air exchange. And later the water levels go down and you get more air exchange. But some people think we should go even later so that we'd have more time for the water levels to go down. But other people think that going later in the season will increase our chances of having bad air. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but what I'm trying to say is we're trying to figure out the best time to go when we might be able to explore more of the passages. Have you read anything about that would be applicable to this situation?
I think in tropical environments, it's going to be really difficult because, in temperate environments even Texas kind of qualifies as temperate in that sense. You can predict seasonally when the good air and bad air are going to occur. I think a tropical environment is much more difficult. The ideal situation would be to place some kind of a
logger, yeah,
in there and have that, do your work for you. We tried that at Gorman Falls, and it turns out it's hard to find reliable loggers that can be operate in the cave environment that'll work up to 5, 10, 15% CO2. So the challenge is finding a good data logging instrument that you can put in there. The cheap alternative would be if you had somebody local down there in Belize. Are you in Belize full time or?
Oh, no. See, that's just it. We only come once a year, and to get down to where the bad air is, you'd have to rig the entire cave and all 8 drops down to the passages where we finally hit the bad air. And there's no one locally to do that. And the cave's in this guy's front yard, so it's not like you're gonna leave the cave open. We have to close it whenever we leave. So realistically, no, we can't really easily have someone test it. A meter would be a great idea if you have a recommendation, but we would only be coming back to it a year later. I don't know if there's something appropriate or not.
Yeah. Well, keep in touch because we're looking into more meters because we want to use some more meters. We used a Vasila CO2 meter from the Reeker lab, and I felt real bad about it. He didn't seem to care, but we completely trashed that thing, and just complete and utter failure. But we can probably get some better meters to work in the future. We'll share with you what we learn on that.
Okay, thanks.
I think John Lyles might have something to say about that.
Well, no, I wasn't going to talk about the meters. I was going to talk about the human production of CO2 because Ellen Trotner and Aaron Lynch are on here. And a few years ago, when the elevators at Carlsbad were shut down for maintenance, and there was a long period where there would only be a big line waiting to get out of the cave at the airlock in the big room. And Sonia Meyer did a study. I thought I saw her name on here, but I don't see it now. But she did a study, and indeed, the people crowding around the elevator had elevated CO2 levels quite a bit, just from the people waiting for the elevator there.
Yeah, and actually now, because of the pandemic, people are looking more and more into indoor air CO2 monitoring because it is an indication of how well ventilated the indoor air is. So hopefully that means, unfortunately, the levels in indoor air are still probably well below 0.5%, but it might mean that we'll start to see some better monitors and loggers popping up moving forward.
I see a comment in there about chat about gas meters. I can't emphasize enough how the typical gas meter that you find for confined space is not going to tell you about CO2, and it's better than not having a meter at all. But in the most innocuous environments are the ones where you have enough oxygen but too much CO2. And that's why the easy caps or a dedicated CO2 meter are a really good idea. You know, and the easy caps are, again, it's an off-label use of a product, but hey, they work wonderfully.
Can you touch on the use?
Can somebody post a link to the easy caps? I can't find them on Amazon.
Yeah, I'll grab them right now, Kevin.
A common technique from Southwest Virginia is the use of a canary, but typically they were used in coal mines, as see Naomi Orndorff has pointed out.
Wow.
Okay.
Up there.
Yeah. But yeah, we've not tried the canary test, but the you know, when the easy caps turn canary yellow, it's time to leave.
So if the canary turns purple, we can stay? Is that?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
I did want to comment on an earlier thing I said in the chat, because it was pointed out that I definitely misspoke. So someone was asking about pulse oxes and their use in cave. And so, yes, pulse oxes, they will tell you the same thing if it's reading oxygen or carbon monoxide. And so you can have, you know, when you have patients that are in a garage that have tried to kill themselves by leaving their car running or something like that in a garage, it'll still read 100% on a pulse ox because you have all the, it's reading what's attached to the hemoglobin, and CO will attach readily to hemoglobin. I'm not totally sure on the CO2 topic. Someone else had looked into that. I believe it was Kevin. And he said that there was some evidence showing that it did read as well, so it might still be the same answer, but I'm not totally sure.
Well, I think that's one of our plans. With Dr. Iki was talking about doing some pulse ox studies when we're working at Colorado Bend. You know, it's a really nice laboratory for working there because we know the range of CO2 levels in the caves and the hazard's well understood. A cave called Lemon's Ranch Cave in particular, it doesn't get above the IDLH except in one place, which is very well documented, but there's plenty of space you can work from 1 to 3% CO2. So it would be a great place to put a pulse ox on some people and really measure what's going on in the environment.
So I wanted to show you these cylinders I have. This is 2%. This is 5% CO2, and this is 0%. So these are calibration cylinders that I'm using to evaluate different meters to see how they agree. And also an online system that's actually real-time monitoring that I'm getting, that's sitting over here right now. It's not in a cave yet, but it hopefully will be in a cave sometime this summer. But so I'm actually getting these sample gases from Granger so that I can calibrate it and check it in the cave without having to take it out of the cave.
What's in the gas mix that you have there?
Nitrogen and CO2 only. Like this one is 2% CO2 and the remain is nitrogen. And the other one is the same thing, it's nitrogen and CO2. And the one that's 0 CO2 is 99.999% nitrogen.
So we had a real interesting, we were very surprised to find that our butane lighter results were different from Gary's. And I think there's a lot of different potential reasons for that. One could be the dynamics of the BIC lighter itself versus a different type of butane lighter. Another could be whatever other gases were present in the mix. So one thing we're talking about doing and haven't done yet is actually simulating these atmospheres in a flow-through chamber and, you know, seeing what kind of consistency we get in flame out on you know, disposable lighters and other lighters in that environment, because you know, that there's a big difference between 17.5% and 14%.
Yeah, I just wondering if I can sort of jump in here for a minute. Can people hear me or not?
Not really well.
No, maybe I'll try this.
Oh, there's
Is that
Gary.
better? Can you hear me now?
That's better.
Okay. Just one of the things that I think really needs to be highlighted is that the main issue with atmospheres is normally the carbon dioxide level for the human body, not so much the oxygen level. The hemoglobin obviously transports the oxygen and carbon dioxide around the human body. And if you're in a high atmosphere of carbon dioxide, up to say 7%, and that's about the human tolerance, and where people start dropping off the perch if you get above 7%. If it's a high carbon dioxide level, then the hemoglobin is taken up by the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere and also in your blood, because it's trying to get rid of the excess carbon dioxide from your blood. And if the atmosphere is the same as what your blood is, then it can't get rid of it. So it doesn't matter what percentage the oxygen level is in the atmosphere. It can be 21% or 35%, wouldn't matter. Your body still can't take on oxygen, and so you suffocate. So it depends on what method, whether it's type 1, 2, or 3, is what the level of the carbon dioxide is compared to the oxygen. And so it's not really the oxygen that's going to be the governing factor, it's the carbon dioxide level. So even though you use your cigarette lighter, your match or candle or whatever method, you're only testing the oxygen level. And that's not the critical thing, it's the carbon dioxide level. But generally speaking, I've found with all of the atmospheres in Australia with really high levels, that once your match goes out, or your cigarette lighter is probably the best thing to use, that's time to get out. And I have done tests where I've taken instruments down and subjected myself to, and a couple of other willing participants in the caving club, up to 7%. And I can tell you it is horrendous at 7% carbon dioxide. It feels like someone splitting an axe through the middle of your head. You can't think properly. You've just got no energy, and you're breathing like you've been running an absolute marathon, even though you're sitting still. And we had to get out of there fairly quickly after a very short period of time. We just didn't have energy or anything. And we've done all the flame tests where you sort of light the cigarette lighter and you drop it down into the higher or less oxygen level. And you can see the flame sort of flickering way above the cigarette lighter with a big gap in between. So I suppose my point was just to reinforce that you really have to look at the carbon dioxide level as the real big danger in most cases. That's me over.
Yeah.
Sorry for taking too long.
Yeah.
I'm looking now at an electronic component online that's a CO2 monitor, but I'm thinking its threshold is too low for this. It says it can measure up to 50,000 ppm. Is that useless in these environments?
That's
Good.
That's 5%. That's useful.
Useful?
Yep, that's
Okay.
perfect.
Dump it in the chat. What is it?
Well, let's see here. It's a component, so you'd need to build your electronics around it, but it seems like it would be really fairly easy. And regarding Carol's comment earlier, it mentions having a preheat time of 3 minutes. So you'd need a pretty big battery to get that down in for a year into a cave in Belize, but you might be able to use it for some, smaller studies.
Yeah, some of the cheap detectors, and also some of the older detectors, use actually an incandescent light bulb and a filter, and they look at the IR, the NIR component. That's how they measure it, is with IR. And I think those things are real power hogs. So if you can find one of the LEDs, they're a lot more efficient these days.
I'll have to dig into this to see what its method is.
We were real impressed with that little $400, again, that's not an insurmountable expense, CO2meter.com unit. You have to protect it, and I'm notoriously hard on gear, so I kind of ripped the button cover off of mine. But it still works with a little bit of TLC. But you could build a protective case around that meter. And so for an individual caver, okay, maybe $400 isn't something you want to drop. But if you're running a cave rescue response team, get your team a CO2 meter. It is well worth the investment, and the calibrations just to atmospheric air, and the numbers always were within about 5% of what the gas bags analyzed.
Okay, here's one for $56. Again, it's a component, and like Will said, I wouldn't recognize or advise this for a rescue team, but could be good for a long-term monitor.
Just to change the subject a little tiny bit, I noticed someone commented earlier about the carbon monoxide compared to carbon dioxide. Carbon monoxide attaches to your hemoglobin, but does not easily let go. So, if you get in carbon monoxide in a car or whatever, then it attaches and won't let go, and that's why you end up going downhill fairly quickly. But carbon dioxide, if you get the person to the good atmosphere, it can reverse fairly quickly, unless you've been in a carbon dioxide atmosphere for quite a period of time, say half an hour, and it's starting to change your the acidity in your blood. So your body starts producing a lot of chemicals to try and counteract the acidity that's occurring in the blood. And that's when, even if you get to the good atmosphere outside, then it's going to take days, or even could take a week to get back to normal, because of all the chemicals that are going around your body trying to neutralize everything. So I hope that answers the person's query about carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide difference.
The one anecdotal report we got from a caver in Texas, who shall remain nameless after a high CO2 experience, but one that has a lot of impact on young cavers, was this individual's report that after he came out of a high CO2 environment, 22-year-old guy experienced erectile dysfunction for 6 days. So, if nothing else gets you, think about that. You want to be cognizant of CO2. Keep that from happening to you.
Thanks, Will. Does anybody else have any additional questions or comments before we wrap this up for the evening?
Yeah. Will, was that dysfunction or malfunction?
I'll have to consult the individual. I think from him, I think malfunction is probably normal.
I'm gonna say, are we sure it's not operator
Operator error, yeah.
I had a question. There's talk about CO2 buildup from people in caves, but is there much danger from cooking underground, like in cave camp, like using a jet boiler or something?
I'd say it depends on the ventilation, how well ventilated the cave is. I mean, I've done a fair amount of that, never had a problem, but it's a well ventilated cave with 2 entrances. If you're, deep in a system that doesn't have good air circulation.
An incident that happened in Australia was some snowboarders got trapped in a snow cave, and I was actually in another snow cave within a kilometre of them. They did some cooking in the snow cave with their fuel stoves, and part of the coroner's report that they passed away because of carbon monoxide. So just obviously that's not a highly ventilated cave, but a snow cave that they dug out, and I was stuck in the same blizzard not far from them. Our group survived and they didn't. So it's just something to be aware of, that if you're cooking in an area that's not ventilated well, you could get the carbon monoxide poisoning, because the carbon monoxide just keeps attaching to your hemoglobin, won't let go, and it's like an accumulative thing, whereas carbon dioxide is different in that it'll release. As soon as you've built up the carbon dioxide, you get to a good atmosphere, within no time it's come out of your body and freed up your hemoglobin.
All right, thanks.
I just share briefly, the funniest carbon monoxide karst experience I ever had was I got a call on a Friday evening about 10 years ago saying, we have a sinkhole that's on fire and we need you to come down. And I'd never heard of such a thing. Well, it turned out a guy was a hulled tipple, which is the residue from coal mining that's not economic. And at the end of the day, he had a sinkhole on his property. The karst was adjacent to the coal fields, and he would dump the last load of tipple into his sinkhole. Well, he'd been doing this over the years, but it was a trucking company, so he also had waste tires and he had waste oil. So he built this layer cake of tipple, tires, and oil. And then it's got too big, and one Sunday he decided to light it on fire. And the following Friday is when I got the call. And they didn't call, the neighbors didn't call about the fire. They called on Friday when all the carbon monoxide detectors in all the houses within about a quarter mile of the fire started going off. And the CO was actually going down through the karst and coming up in these basements. And yeah, it was a pretty neat scene putting that fire out. And my role was the dye tracing end of it to figure out where the contaminants from the fire suppression would end up. But it was, yeah, literally carbon monoxide detectors is what threw that response into full gear. The fire on the surface was out. The tipple underground was burning.
Back to Gerard's question for just a second with the cooking in caves and the like. There's a community of nutcases on the internet called Backpacking Light Forums. There are people there who've done extensive studies on what it means to cook using various stoves in your vestibules and the quickly elevating carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide levels for various stoves. So you can actually go there and figure out like which stove will kill you fastest.
Another thing to worry about is the NATO Norwegian heat pack. I mean, it's the best rewarming method I know of for adding heat to someone, either in a cave or above ground. And it has it burns a charcoal briquette, but it has a platinum catalyst in it to convert all of the carbon monoxide to carbon dioxide. But still, it's a concern about the carbon dioxide, and you're always supposed to make sure that the outlet tube is, away from the patient's face and away from anyone who's carrying the litter's face too. But that's another situation where you might worry about carbon dioxide buildup in caves. Although it's as warm as a 75-watt light bulb in with the patient, which is a lot of heat, and it lasts for about 8 to 12 hours on a briquette. So it's a pretty impressive hypothermic rewarming device and doesn't weigh very much.
What was the manufacturer on that one?
It's a company in Norway, but it's a NATO heat pack. I've got a web page describing it. I'll post it in just a second here.
Nice.
Anybody else have any other questions or thoughts, comments about high CO2 bad air environments?
Anybody who's part of the cave rescue team, please humor us. Get some expired easy caps from your squad. Throw them in your IRT bags. You'll be glad you have them. Not used, expired.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. You can get in touch with us. You can email me and I can get comments to Will and Zenah or whatever else. Like, we are happy. We love talking about this, and we will happily, I was so excited to have this discussion with some of the folks here who are also engaged in this work. And just thank you so much for joining us, both for this and then for the whole rescue series. It's been a blast to learn from each other and to talk more about cave rescue. So I don't know if Gretchen, if you have anything else you want to add, but thanks again for joining us tonight.